darlings, Mimi G here at mimigstyle.com, and I am thrilled to be able to offer these step-by-step video tutorials to accompany my Mimi G for Simplicity patterns. Today we're going to be working on pattern 1276. Now the beauty of pattern 1276 is that both the tops and the bottoms are interchangeable. View A and B have the same bodice, but you can change the skirt to either a flared skirt or a tapered skirt. And view C has a completely different top, but can also be used with both skirts. In order to give you the confidence to easily interchange either bodice with the bottom, what we're going to do is we're going to fully construct view A and B of our bodice, which is essentially the same top with a sleeve variation, and we're going to fully construct and line the top for view C. Then what we'll do is at the end of this video, we'll move on to part 2, where I will show you how to fully construct and line both skirt options and attach them to our bodice. Let's go over some of the basic tools you're going to need. You are, of course, going to need pattern 1276. You're also going to need some pattern weights. I just use very large washers from my local home improvement store. You're going to need 2 scissors, one for paper, one for fabric, a disappearing fabric marker, a coordinating 22-inch invisible zipper, coordinating thread, a seam ripper is handy, and of course some pins. You will also need a small piece of fusible knit interfacing. I'm going to be using a poly rayon blend, which works really nicely, does not add a lot of weight to my fabric, and is easily fusible. We're going to start with view A and B. As I mentioned earlier, view A and B are essentially the same top. The only difference is the sleeve length, which we will get to in just a second. Now these are the pattern pieces you need to cut out for view A and B. You're going to need to cut out pattern piece number 1 and pattern piece number 2. You're going to need to cut out pattern piece number 3, which is the back view for all views A, B, and C. You're going to need to cut out number 4 and number 5, number 7 and number 8, which are our waistbands, and then you can decide whether you want to cut out pattern piece number 6 for a short sleeve or pattern piece number 16 for the 3/4 length sleeve. Now the fun part of this pattern is the ability to color block. I'm going to be using 2 different colors, this wonderful dark purple and this lovely lilac. So now all you need to do is decide what pattern piece you want out of what color. Now I'm going to be doing the upper front piece, my sleeve, and my band out of this lighter purple color. I'm going to be doing the back and front piece out of the darker purple. I want you to go ahead and grab pattern piece number 2, 7, and 8, which are our waistbands, and your sleeve, whichever sleeve you chose. And we're going to cut it out of the first color of fabric. Now I have laid my fabric out with right sides facing. The right side is the side that people are going to see. And I have folded it lengthwise with selvage edges meeting. Go ahead and place pattern pieces 16, 7, and 8 onto your fabric. You want to make sure that the grain lines on your pattern piece, this directional line you see, runs parallel to the selvage edge of your fabric. You also want to take note of pattern piece number 7, which says place on the fold of fabric. So you're going to literally place that edge along the fold of your fabric. You're going to be cutting around pattern piece number 7. You're going to cut out pattern piece number 8 and 16, which will give you 2 sleeves, 2 pieces for the back band, and 1 piece on the fold for the front band. Now you're going to need to take into account that pattern piece number 2 says to cut 1 of fabric, so you don't need to lay it over both layers of your fabric. You only need to cut out 1 layer of this pattern piece. I have cut out my 1 piece for the upper front. I've cut my front band on the fold. I have 2 pieces for the back band, and I have cut out 2 sleeves. Now you're going to need to do this again out of lining, except for the sleeve. So lay out your lining fabric the same way that we did our fabric, and you're going to cut out the back band, the front band on the fold, and 1 upper front out of lining. I'm going to show you how I like to transfer my markings and slit my notches. It's really important that you always transfer any dots, small dots, large dots, notches that you see on your pattern pieces. They help in the construction of your pattern. So the easiest way for me to do it is I take a pin and I put it through my pattern piece at whatever size I have cut. And once it's through both layers, I take my disappearing fabric marker or chalk and I make a dot. I lift my pattern pieces and I mark my fabric, and then I lift both fabric pieces and I mark the bottom. That way when I remove my pin and my pattern piece, I have marked both sides of my fabric. And then I will do that for all of the dots and markings that I see. For notches, I simply make a small snip into each triangle. Now you're going to cut out the remaining pattern pieces out of your contrast colored fabric. You're going to cut out pattern piece number 3 and number 1. Make sure that you read the instructions on the pattern piece where it says cut 1 or cut 2. You're also going to need to cut these out of lining. Now that you've cut out your fabric and you have cut out your lining, the only thing left to do is to cut out pieces 4 and 5 out of interfacing. I have a piece of interfacing here on my table, and the bumpy side, the fusible side, is up facing me. I'm going to fold it in half. And I'm going to lay my pattern pieces like I would my fabric. Pattern piece number 4 states to place it on the fold of the fabric. So I'm going to do just that. I'm going to place it on the fold of my interfacing. And I'm going to cut around it. And I'm going to do the same thing for piece number 5. It is not cut on the fold, so I'm going to be cutting out 2. So I have 2 pieces for the back, and I have 1 piece on the fold. And now we're going to fuse these pieces to our front and back piece of our top. Now we're going to fuse our interfacing onto our bodice neckline. And so we're going to fuse the bumpy side to the wrong side of our fabric. Now you know which is the wrong side because we've marked on it. So I want you to lay your bumpy side onto the wrong side of your upper front piece. And we're going to press until it fuses. No back and forth motion, just hold and press. Once it's fused together, it becomes one. Now we're going to do the same thing to the wrong side of our back. I want you to get the bumpy side and put it on. Make sure it's the right side. There we go. Bumpy side to wrong side of fabric. And press and hold. Once we have our interfacing fused to our necklines, we can get started sewing. Make sure you're using a ballpoint needle or stretch needle, and that you are using either a stretch stitch on your sewing machine or a very narrow zigzag. Now we're going to start with the upper front and lower front pieces, and we're going to place them with right sides facing, and we're going to pin at our notch first. So we're going to attach our color block top to our bottom. So we're going to pin at the end and then at the other end. And then once more in between these two pins. And now we're going to sew using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now when we open it, we have one full front piece.
Continue.
Now turn it around, take it to your ironing table, and I want you to press this seam open. I have pressed my seams open, and now we're going to attach at the shoulder and at the side. So get your back piece, and with right sides facing, we're going to pin at the shoulder, matching notches. And pin at the front. And then we're going to pin down the side. So align your notches front to back. Pin at the bottom. And now you're going to do the same thing on the other shoulder. So grab the other back piece. Pin the shoulder. Align your side notches. And now we're going to sew our shoulder seam using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And we're going to sew down our side seam starting at the bottom and sewing our way up. Make sure to keep your seam allowance flat as you sew over it. And you're going to sew the other shoulder and side seam the same way, and you're going to press your seams open. Now we're going to work with our band front and back pieces. So I want you to lay your front band with right sides facing you, and I want you to place your back band with right sides facing the right side of the front, and matching your notches on the side and pin. And then pin at the bottom. And now you're going to do the same thing with the other side. Align your notch. Pin at the bottom. And now we're going to sew across the sides of our band. 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And you're going to sew the other one the same way. Once you've sewn the back to the front of your bands, I want you to go ahead and press the seam open like I did. And then grab your bodice, and we're going to attach our band to the lower bottom of our top. So with right sides facing, we're going to first match our notches in the center front, so go ahead and pin. And then I want you to pin at your side seams, so make sure that your seams are aligned. Match your notch and pin. And then do the same thing on the other side. Match your side seams. And match your notch. And now we're going to sew all across the bottom using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure your seam allowances stay flat when you sew over them. Now we have attached our band onto our top. And now we're going to press this seam open. Now that you have attached your waistband to your bodice and you have pressed your seam open, I'm going to have you set this aside, and you're going to do the exact same thing all over again, but you're going to be doing it with your lining pieces. So you're going to construct your lining the same way that we did our bodice. Okay, now you should have your lining sewn together the same way that we sewed together our top. And so what we're going to do is we're going to partially attach this at the neckline, and then we're going to attach our sleeve, set it aside, and move on to part 2 where we sew the bottom of our dress and then join them. So for now, we're going to take the lining, and with right sides facing, we're going to place it over our top. And we're going to pin at the shoulder first. So align your shoulder seams. And then pin at the other shoulder. And then pin right in the middle. And then we're going to sew, but we're going to leave about 2.5 inches unsewn. So I'm going to put a pin about 2.5 inches from the edge right there. And we're going to sew from one end to the other, stopping on the other side. And then we'll do all of our finishing after. So go ahead and pin. Okay, and now we're going to sew 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then you're going to back stitch and stop at the other pin. Now we're going to trim our neckline down. So we're going to trim our seam allowance to 1/4 inch, starting just after our stitching. And once we have trimmed our seam allowance, we're going to understitch. So you're going to open this up, and you're going to make sure that the seam allowance is facing the lining. And what you're going to do is you're going to start right where our stitching is, and you're going to sew close to the edge on the lining. So make sure that your seam allowance is facing the lining, because that's what you want to catch. Now that we have understitched our neckline, we can turn this over, and we want to press our neck so that the lining is to the inside and we have a nice crisp neckline. Now that we've pressed our neckline and we have our lining nicely pressed and understitched, we're going to now sew our lining to our bodice at the armhole. So we're going to stitch this together so we can attach our sleeve. So what we're going to do is we're working on the right side. So on the inside you have the right side of your lining, and on the outside you have the right side of your fabric. And we're going to pin first at the shoulder. So you want to make sure that both your seam allowances are nice and flat. And you're going to align and then pin at the shoulder. And then I want you to pin at the underarm seam, so make sure that your seams match up. And pin. And then make sure that your notches match up and pin there. And the same thing on the other side. And now we're just going to sew a 1/2 inch all the way, or 1/2 inch away from the edge of our fabric all the way around. Using a basting stitch, we just want to hold this in place so we can attach our sleeve. Starting at the shoulder, sew all the way around. And now we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Pin at the shoulder, underneath the arm, at your notches, and sew all the way around using a basting stitch. Okay, now that we basted together our armhole, we're going to sew our sleeve. So set this aside for just a sec. And grab one of your sleeves, fold it over with right sides facing, and we're going to pin at the top. I'm going to pin at the bottom and in the middle. Pin at your notch. And we're going to sew 5/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way down. And then I want you to press this seam open and then do the same thing to the other sleeve. Okay, I pressed my seam open and then I pressed it to one side and I serged the edge of my seam allowance because we're not lining the sleeve, and so I just wanted a nice clean finish. You can leave it undone if you'd like. So I'm going to have you turn one sleeve right side out, and we're going to turn our top right side out. Wrong side. Here we go. And so once you have your bodice right side out and your sleeve right side out, I want you to align your underarm seam lines and pin. Once that's pinned, go ahead and work on the other side, on the inside. And you're going to pin, matching your double notches. That's the back of your sleeve. And then you're going to pin your single notch. And you should have a dot at the center sleeve cap, and you're going to pin that dot to your shoulder seam. And you should have another dot along your sleeve cap, which should line up to the dot on your bodice, and so you want to pin there. And the same thing on the other side, you should have a dot, and so you want to line those and pin there. And we're going to ease in our sleeve by pulling just a tad. Now on your sleeve, where we have, on your bodice where we have our lining, we're going to make a couple of snips because we need a little bit of give. I'm just going to make like 3 snips into my seam allowance. And see how now when we pull that, they lay into each other. And so as we're sewing, we're going to be pulling just a tad to ease that in. And if it's more than you can get by pulling, you just simply make a little tiny snip. And that will help ease the sleeve in. And we're going to start at the bottom, underarm seam. And we're going to sew using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure you don't have any ripples or folds underneath. Cut off any loose threads. And if you have a serger, go ahead and serge this seam allowance. If you don't have a serger, you can trim this down to 1/4 inch. And then you can turn your sleeve to the right side and you have a nice curved sleeve cap with no folds. You're going to attach the other sleeve the same way. If you are doing view A and B, which I've done here, now that you have attached your sleeves and our lining is partially attached, you can go ahead and set this aside and move on to part 2, where you're going to sew the skirt lining and attach it to the bodice.